When submarines were first developed, they had an awful reputation, and for good reason. There had been many accidents and many sailors whose graves were on the bottom of the ocean. So much so that the submarine service had earned the nickname the coffin service. In 1939, one of the worst of these incidents would add to this reputation. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Between the end of World War I and the first shots of World War II, navies around the world were tirelessly developing and testing submarine technology. To that point, fighting a war under the sea was done by primitive means, but the early 1920s marked a significant leap forward in submarine capabilities. Countries raced one another to build and deploy more advanced submarines capable of diving deeper, faster, and for longer than ever before. Like other countries, the United States invested heavily in bolstering its navy with top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art subs, and in 1938, it launched its class of Sargo ships, which were equipped with a new lead-acid battery that was resistant to battle damage. One of these was known as the USS Squalus, which was one of the first in its class and was capable of reaching depths of up to 250 feet, surface speeds of up to 20 knots, and distances of 11,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. Even by the growing standards of submarine technology, the Squalus and its sister ship, the USS Sculpin, were advanced beyond their years. They had been designed in the lead-up to World War II for the task of cutting off Japanese trade and could escape enemy planes by fully submerging in less than a minute while operating at full speed, which was something that no other sub could do. Once the Squalus was completed, the Navy began a battery of test dives to ensure that its design was safe and its parts were capable of withstanding all that was expected of it. And this testing process was something that countries took incredibly seriously because a total of 825 men from 18 subs across multiple countries have been killed in sub-accidents between 1921 and 1938. Submarining, as a result, had earned the moniker the coffin service by the media and public. But the Sargo class of ships aimed to undo that reputation. And thankfully, by then, in its test runs, the Squalus was performing its functions and purpose to near perfection. On the morning of May 23, 1939, the Squalus left the mouth of the Piscataqua River for another test dive with a crew that included 53 officers and sailors. Also along for the ride were 2 civilian Navy engineers and a representative from General Motors who had designed the batteries. Then, under the command of Rear Admiral Oliver F. Naquin, the sub was put on a course toward the coast of New Hampshire, just a few miles from the Isle of Shoals. The test for the day would include underwater maneuvers and several dives and resurfaces, and it would be as routine a test as the ship had faced. Around 9 a.m., the horn sounded throughout the sub, indicating a pending dive command from the captain. At this point, the sub was on the surface and traveling at 16 knots, and the admiral stood behind a large board in the control room filled with lights that would illuminate red or green depending on the status of different parts and pieces of the ship. The dive process relied heavily on the engine room crewmen, and at the sound of the horn, they would need to cut the diesel-powered engines quickly and then close the air vents before the ship submerged. Right before he gave the official dive order, the admiral ensured the entire panel was lit up green, and then when everything appeared as it should, he gave the final order and the Squalus dipped beneath the surface. When it did though, a fluttering of air pressure occurred in his ears just before the intercom blared with a sailor shouting to take the ship back up to the surface. Despite what the board indicated, one of the vents was still wide open and seawater was rushing into the engine rooms. Admiral Oliver just stared in disbelief. What was being reported by his crew was impossible based on what he was looking at. But either way, he then immediately ordered that the ballast tanks be blown to get the Squalus to the surface as quickly as possible. Horrifyingly though, the sub took on water faster than it could surface, and after an initial rise, the Squalus slowed to a stop. Meanwhile, in the engine room, the crew was fighting a torrent of water, just trying to survive as the ship tilted downward at a 45-degree angle and then began a rapid descent to the sea floor. It was then that Oliver was faced with a decision no officer ever wants to make. He knew that the survival of anyone on the ship relied on the closure of the watertight doors between the control room and the engine room compartments. Doing this, however, would trap those who were still inside while they flooded completely. But at the same time, not locking off the compartments would ensure that everyone on board would die. Admiral Oliver was known as a strict, no-nonsense discipline leader, and his tact had a very good reason behind it. In submarines, every single decision and action anyone on board can make can result in disaster. There was just no room for error, and at times like that, unfortunately, there was no room for humanity. Oliver then gave the order to seal off the control room compartment with the men inside. As the man responsible for this order, a man named Lloyd Manus, started to put all his weight into closing the 200-pound door, he heard the screams of men begging him to wait, but there was no time. Water was already rushing toward the bulkhead behind them, so the compartment door had to be sealed immediately. As he pulled the door closed, several of those battling the water made it through to safety before it slammed shut. He then cranked its wheel and ensured it was watertight, ultimately sealing the fate of those left in the sub's 4 flooded compartments, including Sherman Shirley, who was Lloyd's best friend. Tragically, Sherman's wedding date was supposed to be the following Sunday, and Lloyd was supposed to be his best man. Among the others were 17 crewmen who tried to seal themselves in the torpedo room and 9 in the engine room and rear battery rooms. One man even climbed a hatch ladder and tried to push open the door to the ocean outside, but the sea pressure was too strong in the door to push it. The Squalus then continued to fall toward the bottom as the batteries in the flood compartments were fried by the water. And as if the uncontrolled descent wasn't terrifying enough, the lights flickered before going out completely, plunging the crew into complete darkness. This then led to a new problem. The chief electrician, Lawrence Gaynor, then grabbed a flashlight and climbed into the crawl space where the batteries were stored. Since the batteries lined the entire length of the ship's keel, many of them were already submerged, but the ones that weren't were wet and at risk of catching on fire. Lawrence also noticed that they were losing voltage fast, causing them to smolder, and if the heat reached the battery cell, there would be an explosion that would crack the hull wide open. Even by the time he reached the batteries, they were already smoking and well on their way to heating past the point of no return. He then flipped one of the disconnect switches, and the flash of light completely blinded him. So next, without his sight, he felt around the other remaining battery and managed to find the second switch to stop it from exploding, narrowly averting a much more serious incident. Back in the control room, they had no idea how far they were going to fall, and the sub was only rated for a maximum depth of 250 feet or 76 meters. If the ocean floor was much further than that, there was a possibility the sub would implode before touching down. All they could do was wait in the silence and darkness as the sub groaned its way deeper and deeper into the ocean. Then, fortunately, and with a heavy thud, the Squalus impacted the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of 240 feet or 73 meters. When it did, it came to a rest, sticking straight up, completely perpendicular to the surface. The 33 survivors were then trapped in the air pocket they had created by sealing off the rest of the sub. However, despite what should have been chaos, they didn't even need a moment to take in the reality of their situation. Their training kicked in, and being trapped at the bottom of the ocean was a scenario they simulated often, so each of them knew their roles and began to execute. The first task was for the sub to signal its location by releasing a buoy that was attached to a cable. The buoy would not only help rescuers spot them, but it would also provide communication between the sub and the surface through the cable. Additionally, the Squalus was able to shoot off flares and smoke bombs to grab the attention of anyone on the surface. As they went through these procedures, the men couldn't help but wonder if anyone in the other compartments ended up surviving, so one of them grabbed a hammer and began tapping on the air lines that ran to the back of the hull. If anyone was alive, they'd respond by doing the same. So after several hammer taps from the control room, they held their breath so they could hear even the faintest tap in return, but there was no reply. It was a reality they didn't want to face, but it was confirmed that nearly half of them had died. Back in the control room, Oliver then ordered some of the men to grab the emergency supplies, which included food, flashlights, oxygen stores, carbon dioxide absorbent, blankets, and coats. He knew they'd probably been for a wait and without power, so it was about to get very cold very quickly. With that being handled, Oliver turned his attention to the next threat to survival, which was their air supply. Taking into consideration the number of survivors, he estimated there was probably 48 hours worth of air before everyone died of suffocation. That seems like plenty of time to be rescued and back on dry land in New Hampshire, but the prudent course of action was to conserve everything that could possibly stretch that time. Oliver then split the men into 2 groups, placing 10 of the healthiest and youngest in the colder torpedo room and keeping the 23 remaining in the warmer control room. One of the men then started handing out devices called Momsen lungs, which are a breathing apparatus that can be used from a reasonable depth to swim to the surface. The crew of the Squalus was 40 feet or 12 meters deeper than the Momsen lungs were rated for, and it was uncertain if they'd even work at that depth. And even if they did work, no one knew if they'd have enough air to reach the surface, so these would have to be used as an absolute last resort. Then, once those were handed out, Oliver instructed the men to nap as much as they were able to prevent panic breathing. Before long, the temperature in the sub was 35 Fahrenheit or 2 Celsius, and the inner hull was beginning to form a layer of ice on it. Some of the men were able to fall asleep, but others weren't, and to stay calm, some of them took to whistling a tune. They would just have to wait until rescue arrived or the air ran out, whichever came first. When the Squalus failed to return to the shipyard when expected, its sister ship, the Sculpin, was preparing to leave New Hampshire for Panama. But upon hearing that the Squalus was in trouble, the Sculpin left port and raced to the coordinates the Navy gave them. When they reached them though, the Sculpin's captain Warren Wilkins was puzzled not to see the emergency buoy anywhere. This was because, somewhere in the rush to get the search of the Squalus underway, the coordinates were written down incorrectly and the sculpin was in the wrong area. If not for one of the ship's lookouts who spotted a flare further out, the Squalus may have never been found. Luckily, that wasn't the case, and Warren then handed down orders to head in that direction, and as they drew close, they spotted the buoy and pulled up alongside it. Below the ocean in the Squalus, the crew actually heard the sound of a sub-engine above them, and morale inside skyrocketed just knowing that help had found them. Moments later, Oliver's voice was heard inside the sculpin. He said hello, and Warren replied in kind, but then a second later, the phone went dead. As the two captains were greeting one another, an ocean swell snapped the buoy cable, and the sculpin quickly lost track of the location of the Squalus. Then for hours afterward, the sculpin had to actually drag a hook along the bottom of the ocean, hoping to run into the sub. They would eventually find it again, but this cost the rescue effort precious time. The sculpin then connected a new buoy and waited for reinforcements from other ships. Then, instead of using a direct communication, they used Morse code to communicate with one another, and the Squalus communicated the number of survivors in the sub. The sculpin then tapped back code for the letters SRC. Oliver immediately knew what that meant, and he expected that he'd hear it at some point. SRC stood for Submarine Rescue Chamber, and there was only one available anywhere on the East Coast. In a stroke of good luck, it just so happened to be in Connecticut at the time of the sub sinking, and a ship called the Falcon was already heading in the direction of the Squalus with it. This 9-ton submarine rescue chamber resembles an upside-down wine glass, and as this name suggests, it could transport survivors from disabled submarines back to the surface. Inside, the chamber is controlled by 2 crewmen who guide it down and connect its bottom to one of the submarine hatches using a watertight rubber gasket. And from there, the hatch doors for both ships are opened and survivors simply climb the ladder into the chamber, which takes them to the surface. At the time, however, this wasn't a tried and true method of rescuing crewmen from subs. The SRC had only ever been used in testing, so this would be the very first true test of its function. Around 4:30 the next morning, the Falcon arrived over the Squalus, and not a moment too soon. As survivors in the sub were approaching the 24-hour mark, Oliver began rationing oxygen. Periodically, he'd order the release of stored emergency oxygen and let it run for a few moments before shutting it back down. By doing this, he hoped to stretch the supply as far as it could, but the impact on the survivors was also obvious. As the Falcon prepared to launch the SRC, the 33 survivors were suffering from headaches and nausea, which are some of the earliest signs of hypercapnia or carbon dioxide poisoning. If this went on long enough, it could end up being fatal. Eventually, a hypercapnia sufferer will simply drift into unconsciousness and not wake up again. Unfortunately, putting himself and his men on the brink of hypercapnia was what Oliver knew was going to keep them all alive as long as possible. By then as well, the other major concern of the sub was hypothermia. Since some of the men had escaped the flooding compartments before they were sealed, they remained soaked through and in temperatures close to freezing. On the surface, the Falcon lowered the SRC into the water and the capsule began its descent along with a support diver. Part of the procedure for safely securing the SRC to a sub was attaching a cable from the rescue chamber to the hatch door, and as simple as it may sound, it was one of the more dangerous jobs for divers. In the 1930s, the Navy Experimental Diving Unit had just begun testing different mixes of helium and oxygen that divers could breathe beyond 100 feet or 33 meters. These were supposed to lessen the onset of nitrogen narcosis. If you've watched the many cave diving videos on the channel, you're probably all too familiar with this concept, but when this rescue was taking place, much of this was barely in its infancy. For those who aren't familiar, as a diver descends while breathing regular air, the increasing water pressure causes nitrogen to become narcotic. Divers can then become disoriented and euphoric while losing motor skills and problem-solving abilities. That far underwater is obviously the last place you want to experience this, but by breathing a gas with a lower concentration of nitrogen at depths beyond 100 feet, it can prevent or greatly reduce the impact of narcosis on a diver. Unfortunately for the divers assisting in the Squalus rescue, these gas mixes weren't used universally, so the longest they could stay at a depth like 240 feet was just 20 minutes. Either way, the diver then descended ahead of the SRC and began to suffer from narcosis symptoms before he reached the sub. This caused him to collide hard with the Squalus. But despite this, he managed to get his bearings and successfully attached the cable. Behind him, the SRC was on its slow descent, and once it reached the vicinity of the sub, the 2 men controlling it inside maneuvered the chamber and settled it over the hatch. Once it was sealed tightly, the water was pumped out, and then when it was clear, the men inside the sub began turning the wheel on the hatch door. As it popped open, water poured in for a second, but thankfully that was just some of the residual from the connection point. Then, a second later, they saw the man inside the SRC standing there holding blankets and coffee. These supplies were much needed for the men who were wet and cold, and more importantly, finally this seems like clear indication that they would be able to leave the bottom of the ocean alive. Once the SRC was attached and communication was established, the men began to plan a way to get everyone to the surface safely. There was only enough room for 8 crewmen at one time, so Oliver split the men into groups based on their condition. The ones who were approaching severe hypothermia would go first, and the ones in the best condition would go last. Once that was clear, the hatch was unsealed and the SRC began returning to the surface. Now, despite being so close to safety, the period between the SRC departing and returning felt excruciatingly long, and the rationing of air didn't make the wait any more bearable. The men would reach a point where their heads were pounding so hard from hypercapnia, they desperately waited for Oliver to switch the oxygen stores back on. In addition, one round trip for the SRC took about 3.5 hours, 1 hour to descend, about an hour to attach and load the chamber, and then another hour and a half to the surface. By then as well, since the survivors had been trapped for more than 24 hours, there was still a chance that the sub could run out of air before everyone was safe. After 3 successful trips, only 10 remained in the final group, one of which was Admiral Oliver. When the time came, he and the others boarded the SRC, and once the hatches were secured, the chamber lifted off the squalls and began a final trip to the surface. On ascent, however, one of these stabilizing cables jammed, causing the chamber to stop abruptly around the 150-foot mark. At the same time, this caused the cable that went from the winch on the Falcon to the top of the chamber to become frayed, and during this, all but 2 of these 7 strands that were the lifelines to the crew had snapped. One of the divers then had to re-enter the water and descend to assess the situation, and it was realized that the stabilizing cable would need to be cut for the chamber to ascend. The problem was that this cable was crucial for both guiding the chamber to and from the sub, but also keeping it from swinging and spinning in the ocean. However, without any other options, this cable was then cut and the chamber began to spin uncontrollably. In order to reset and figure out what to do next, operators then lowered the SRC back down and set it on the ocean floor. This meant that the last few survivors had been less than 200 feet from safety, but once again, they were stuck on the bottom of the Atlantic. Back on the Falcon, there were concerns that the final cable might be at risk of snapping too, so after a brief discussion, rescuers decided not to use the winch and instead they pulled the bell up the full 240 feet by hand. This was an excruciating process that took 4 hours, but it worked, and about 40 hours after plunging to the bottom of the ocean, the surviving crew of the Squalus was saved. Many of them would require medical attention, and some even stayed in the hospital for some time, but all of them survived the ordeal. Once the dust from the rescue had settled, the next order of business for the Navy was to figure out how to salvage the Squalus. It was a brand new, very expensive sub that was at a manageable depth, so the Navy didn't want to leave it there, but at the same time, a salvage operation like it had never been attempted. However, over the course of 4 months, the Navy would work almost around the clock to raise the sub in a series of trial and error attempts. The first idea was to attach deflated pontoons together with long chains. Divers would then slip the chains underneath the Squalus before inflating the pontoons. On the first try though, once the pontoons were filled with air, the Squalus began an uncontrolled descent, and when it broke the surface of the ocean with slightly more speed than expected, it shot loose of the chains and began a second descent all the way back to the ocean floor. In the end, it took 5 different attempts using various methods of attaching those pontoons before the sub could be raised and towed back to the Navy shipyard. When it was secured there, the water was drained from the flooded compartments and 25 of 26 bodies were recovered. During one of these salvage attempts, one of the hatches shot open and one body drifted out of the sub and into the depths, and it was never recovered. Once the Squalus was finally examined, to the relief of the sub's captain and crew, the issue was a mechanical malfunction instead of a human error. This malfunction then prevented some of the vents from closing properly, which was not indicated by the control board. Oliver was then commended for his outstanding leadership, bravery, and the handling of the disaster, but he gave the credit to the crewmen under his command. In a report he wrote for the Navy, Oliver explained that he had witnessed a true example of camaraderie and brotherly love, and each of the crewmen believed himself accountable for the life of the man next to him. And together, they made it through by sharing blankets and huddling into groups to maintain body heat. Those who were better off sacrificed for those in much worse shape, and even Oliver gave up his coat to one of the hypothermic crewmen. Oliver also devoted space in his report to the selfless act performed by the electrician Lawrence. In the captain's mind, Lawrence's quick thinking in disabling the remaining batteries to prevent the explosion was what truly saved them. And this came at a cost for Lawrence too. When he disabled the first battery, it completed a circuit that sent literal lightning bolts around the hull so bright that he'd live the rest of his life with vision issues. Once all of the investigations were finished, although the damage to the Squalus was extensive, it would ultimately be salvageable. After its repairs, it was recommissioned as the USS Sailfish, and 3 of the Squalus survivors even came back to serve as part of the crew. Among the others, 4 died in action during World War II, and Admiral Oliver never commanded another submarine again. He instead opted to become an engineering officer on the USS California, which happened to be a target during Pearl Harbor, but fortunately, he was ashore when the attack began and survived. 2 years later, the Sculpin was sunk by a Japanese destroyer, and the Sailfish returned the favor by sinking that destroyer. It then served admirably during World War II and was eventually decommissioned shortly after. And more than 80 years later, the rescue and recovery of the Squalus and its crew is still one of the Navy's most challenging operations ever. To this day, the incredible effort of Oliver and the crew is part of the Navy's official handbook on submarine rescue. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.